Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Josh Steimle, author of Chief Marketing Officers at Work. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Are you ready to get started?
I'm ready.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
The one thing I wish I had done better preparing for my book was to build an audience first. I thought, hey, I'm going to write a great book. I'm going to get it out there. Everybody's going to love it. And once it was out there, I realized, gee, if you don't already have an audience, then nobody's really prepared to buy this thing. And so if I had created an email list earlier, if I had been more proactive on social media, it would have gone a lot further, a lot faster. And so that's the one thing I really wish I would have done, was build that audience first.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
I think the hardest part is actually writing a good book. I mean, people, they focus on getting an agent, or they focus on the self-publishing side of it, or they focus on the marketing side of it. But it seems like a lot of people forget that in order to get published, you've got to have a really good book, something that's worth reading, something that people want to read. And anybody who has written a book knows how much work it takes to write a book. But writing a good book takes that much more work times 4.
Yeah, and especially making that connection too. That's the one thing I feel is the most important part about a book. It's not just about the knowledge, but it's also about connecting with the reader. Really do feel that's critical.
Yeah, having empathy for your reader and really understanding them. I mean, the thing is, a good book, yes, it's important to have marketing. Yes, it's important to have a good publisher if you're going with a publisher and things like that. But if you have a good book, it covers up a lot of other problems that you can have. I mean, a good book can break out and do really well, even if it's not going through a great publisher, even if the marketing's not that great, even if you don't have an audience. A great book can overcome those barriers. But if you have a bad book, all that marketing, all that other stuff, yeah, your book might sell well for about a week, and then people will realize, hey, this is junk, and it's not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely. Not being vulgar, but there's an old phrase about you can't polish a turd, right? And that's the same concept with that. Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
So when I was writing my book, Chief Marketing Officers at Work, I realized I've got a lot of great material here, and I was also writing for Forbes magazine at the time. And so one of the things I did is I knew how the process worked at Forbes. I knew how to get articles in there because I was writing there and I was getting pitched all the time. And so I took a bunch of the material from my book and I turned it into articles. So I would take the answers that a bunch of the people I interviewed gave me, and I'd put those together into a topical article focusing on a certain topic. And I would send that off to somebody at Forbes and say, hey, here's an article. I've got these interviews with these great CMOs answering this one question. So here's an article about answers from 6 top CEOs to this question. And so I was able to get a lot of those articles published. And in those articles, it would say, this is based off of responses to this question from Chief Marketing Officers at Work, this book that Josh Steimle wrote. And so that was a great way to get credibility and exposure for the book by turning that book into articles and turning it into quotable parts that I could send out to people as pitches.
Well, you bring up a great point, too, talking about the repurposing aspect, but also having a strategic outlook with it where you repurposed parts of the book and those interviews that you had with the CEOs, and you were able to package that and to pitch that to have these different articles, which would then backlink to the book. Right.
So it's a great marketing machine, and I'm still getting book sales off of that because those articles are still out there. So it's long-lasting marketing for the book.
Now, were you doing this just with Forbes, or were you doing this with other magazines as well online?
I did it with other magazines as well. So I had a lot of contacts in the online magazine industry. So I had contacts at Mashable and other places. And so I was reaching out to a lot of writers at a lot of different publications saying, hey, I've got all this great material from these interviews I did from this book. I'd love to send you some articles that you can publish. And here's a free, high quality article with great sources and great quotes. And people ate that up.
Excellent. And then when your book actually launched, that's obviously going to help, and it's going to keep continued sales going and continued momentum and views with your book. What other strategies were you using specifically for the launch phase of your book?
Well, I had these contacts in these magazines, and so one great thing was when my book came out, because I had already developed contacts in the magazines, there were people who knew me and knew the book who were willing to say nice things about it. So somebody in Forbes wrote an article about the top marketing books that CMOs should read, and they included my book. And somebody at Success Magazine who knew of me and knew of the book wrote an article calling my book one of the best business books of 2016, which frankly, it probably wasn't. But that was really nice of them to say. And it gave some great publicity to the book as part of its launch phase, because then I could send the book out to people and say, hey, Success Magazine called this one of the top business books of 2016. And so that really helped with the publicity and the credibility of the book.
Yeah, that's some of the best social proof you can get right there.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of books, I'd like to ask about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
So I love reading. I read tons of books, and asking me what my favorite book is like asking me which of my children is my favorite child. So I can't answer which is my favorite book, but one of my favorite books is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. He's a famous venture capitalist and entrepreneur. And what I love about this book is that it's about the gritty side of being an entrepreneur. And this guy did very well. He sold his company for $1.6 billion or something, but he went through a lot of hard times and a lot of near failure and failure before he got to that point. And he goes through the real side of that in this book. I've read it about 8 times now because it's so good. And it just reminds me that, hey, when I'm going through hard stuff with my business or with my writing or with anything else in life, that's normal. That's what everybody's going through. This picture that magazines present of people living it up and having the easy life and driving Lamborghinis and living in big houses and stuff, that's not reality. The reality doesn't get reported, and that leaves the rest of us feeling like we're doing something wrong, and that if we knew what we were doing, then we would experience the success that the guys in the magazines have. But the reality is we're all failing. We're all trying to figure this stuff out. We're all confused. And we keep trying, and we make it if we keep trying. And that's what I love about this book. It's just a lesson about perseverance and just keeping on.
And for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So one of my favorite quotes, I love quotes as much as I love books, but one that I just came across today as I was doing some writing it's a quote from Karl von Clausewitz. Probably murdering that name, but he was a Prussian general back in the 1800s, and he said, the enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. Sometimes we focus on getting things just perfect, and we never actually execute because we're trying to find that perfect plan and get everything just ready. I think that applies a lot to the writing process as well. You could probably say the enemy of a good book is the dream of a perfect book. If you're trying to write that perfect book, it's never going to happen, and it might prevent you from getting a good book out there.
Yeah, it's funny when I do speaking, when I talk about publishing, I always talk about don't be afraid to take the plunge. Done is better than perfect. And then I have this quote, which I'm probably just going to butcher the heck out of, by General George Patton, talking about, you know, there is no such thing as a perfect plan. Essentially, a plan violently executed today is better than the perfect plan next week. And it flows perfectly with what you were talking about.
Exactly. It's just we strive so much to perfect our plans, and action and execution is often where it's at.
You know, or to quote the great philosopher Larry the Cable Guy, get her done.
Yep.
Well, Josh, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
My website, joshsteimle.com.
Well, Josh, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.